After everything they've been through, what does love look like when the waiting finally ends? Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore a quiet but powerful moment, the day Diep fully recovers, leaves the hospital, and finally goes home with James. A story not about drama, but about healing, choosing each other, and finding peace after fear. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The morning arrives without urgency, no alarms, no hurried footsteps in the hallway. Just a soft light slipping through the narrow gap between the curtains, resting quietly on the edge of the hospital bed. Diep wakes before James does. For a moment she stays still, listening. Not to the machines, not to distant voices, but to her own breathing. It is steady, clear, no weight on her chest, no dizziness when she shifts her head on the pillow. She blinks slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast might break the feeling. This is the first morning she wakes up and does not feel sick. James is asleep in the chair beside her bed, his jacket folded over the armrest, his posture slightly crooked, like someone who forgot to take care of himself because he was too busy staying. His face looks softer when he sleeps, less guarded, less tired, even though she knows he is. Diep watches him for a long moment. There is something different in the air today, not excitement, not relief, something calmer than both, a quiet certainty. When the doctor arrives, the conversation is simple. No dramatic pauses, no complicated explanations. Your results look good, the doctor says, flipping through the chart. You've recovered well. You can go home today. That's it. No countdown, no warning. Just 4 words that land gently, like they belong there. You can go home today. James looks up first. He doesn't speak right away. His shoulders drop slightly, as if he's been holding them up for days without realizing it. Diep feels the moment settle inside her before she reacts. She nods, once, slowly, as if agreeing with something she's already known. "Thank you," she says. Her voice is steady. After the doctor leaves, the room feels bigger, quieter, almost unfamiliar. Diep exhales, a long breath she didn't know she was still holding. James stands, unsure what to do with his hands, then sits again, then finally smiles, small, restrained, like he doesn't want to scare the moment away. "So," he says softly, "we're really going home?" She smiles back. "Yeah, we are." They don't rush to pack. There's no need. James folds her clothes carefully, the way he's learned to do over the past days. Diep watches him from the bed, her legs already resting on the floor. She feels strong enough to stand on her own now. That realization surprises her more than the doctor's words. The room empties slowly, a charger unplugged, a cup thrown away, the bed stripped of its sheets. Each small action makes the space feel less like a place of waiting, and more like something they're done with. When Diep finally stands, James instinctively moves closer, ready to catch her. She notices it, and places her hand on his arm. "I'm okay," she says gently. He nods, but he doesn't step away. He just adjusts, staying near without hovering. It's something they've both learned, how to be there without fear. They leave the room together. The hallway looks different when you're not walking it with uncertainty. The same white walls, the same quiet footsteps, but now there's no heaviness pressing down on each step. James carries a small bag. Diep carries nothing. She doesn't need to. As they walk toward the exit, she reaches for his hand. Their fingers laced together naturally without thought. They walk slower than everyone else, not because they have to, but because they want to. At the doors, Diep pauses. She looks back once, not with sadness, not with gratitude, just acknowledgement. A chapter closed. Outside, the air feels cooler than she expects, fresher. The sky is pale, unassuming, like it's giving them space instead of demanding attention. James opens the car door for her, then waits until she's seated comfortably before closing it. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. The drive home is quiet. Not the awkward kind, the comfortable kind. The kind where words would only interrupt what's already understood. Diep rests her head against the window, watching the world move by. She feels like she's returning to herself piece by piece. When they arrive, the house looks exactly the same, and somehow completely different. James unlocks the door and steps aside, letting her enter first. Diep hesitates at the threshold, then steps inside. The smell of home wraps around her instantly. Familiar, warm, real. She takes off her shoes and stands there for a second, overwhelmed by how ordinary everything is. The couch, the table, the light filtering through the window. Her chest tightens, not from pain, but from something fuller. James sets the bag down quietly. He watches her as she walks slowly into the living room, touching the back of the chair, the edge of the shelf, as if confirming that it's all still here. She sits on the couch and lets herself sink into it. "He didn't realise how much I missed this," she says. James nods. "Me neither." He goes to the kitchen without asking, moving on instinct. Diep listens to the soft sounds, water running, a pan placed on the stove. She closes her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she doesn't feel like she has to stay alert. When James returns, he hands her a glass of warm water. "Just for now," he says. "We'll eat later." She takes it, their fingers brushing briefly. "You always know," she says quietly. He shrugs. "I'm learning." They sit together side by side, not touching at first. Then slowly, Diep leans into him. James adjusts, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The gesture is natural now, easy, no hesitation. She rests her head against his chest. His heartbeat is steady beneath her ear. "I'm really okay," she says, not to reassure him, to say it out loud for herself. "I know," he replies. "I can feel it." They stay like that for a while, letting the silence do its work. Outside, life continues, cars passing, distant voices. But inside, time slows down. Diep finally looks up at him. "Thank you," she says. "For what?" "For staying," she answers. "Not because you had to, but because you chose to." James meets her gaze. His eyes are calm, clear. "There was never another choice," he says. She smiles, not because the words are big, but because they're true. As the afternoon light shifts across the room, Diep realizes something else. She's not just healed, she's home. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough. James tightens his arm around her slightly and she closes her eyes again. No more waiting, just being here. The house settles into a rhythm as the afternoon drifts toward evening. James moves quietly, as if sound itself might disturb the fragile peace that has followed them home. He opens windows, letting fresh air roll through the rooms, lifting the stillness left behind by days of absence. Diep watches him from the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a soft blanket resting over her lap. She doesn't feel weak anymore, just tender, like something newly mended that deserves care. When he starts cooking, the familiar sounds fill the space. The gentle chop of vegetables, the low hiss of oil in the pan. These ordinary noises feel almost sacred now. Diep closes her eyes again, letting them wash over her. She hadn't realized how much she missed this. The proof of life continuing, unafraid. James brings the food over carefully, setting it on the table in front of her. Nothing fancy. Soup, warm and light, bread torn by hand instead of cut. "Try a little," he says. No rush. She lifts the spoon, pausing for a moment before tasting it. The warmth spreads slowly, grounding her in her body again. She nods, smiling up at him. "It's perfect." He sits across from her, watching closely but not anxiously. This too is new. The balance, the trust. They eat in silence, not because there's nothing to say, but because everything that matters has already been spoken in quieter ways. When she finishes, Diep leans back, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, content. Later, they move to the bedroom. The bed is made with fresh sheets, the window cracked open just enough to let the evening breeze slip in. Diep Diep stands at the doorway for a moment, taking it in. This room had felt distant before, like a place she wasn't sure she'd return to as herself. Now it welcomes her back without question. She sits on the edge of the bed, then lies back slowly, testing how it feels. Different from the hospital bed, softer, alive. James stands nearby, uncertain. "Do you want me to stay?" she says immediately. He doesn't hesitate. He lies beside her, careful at first, then relaxes as she turns toward him. They face each other, close enough to share breath. Diep reaches out, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips, memorizing something she already knows. "You look tired," she says. He smiles faintly. "I'll sleep later." "No," she says gently. "Sleep now." She pulls him closer, resting her forehead against his chest. He exhales, the tension finally leaving his body. His arm wraps around her, firm and certain. For a moment, neither of them moves. "I was scared," James admits quietly, "even when I didn't show it." "I know," Diep replies. "I was too. But not anymore," he says. She nods. "Not anymore." They drift like that, suspended between wakefulness and rest. Outside, the sky deepens into blue. Inside, everything feels held. When Diep wakes again, it's dark. The room is lit only by a soft lamp near the window. James is still beside her, awake this time, his gaze unfocused as if lost in thought. She shifts slightly and he looks down immediately. "Hey," he whispers. "Hey," she answers, smiling. She sits up slowly, feeling steady. "Can we go outside?" He studies her face, then nods. "Yeah, we can." They step onto the small porch together, the cool night air brushing against their skin. The street is quiet. A few distant lights glow softly, indifferent and kind. Diep wraps her arms around herself. Then James drapes his jacket over her shoulders without a word. They sit side by side, watching nothing in particular. "For a while," Diep says softly, "I thought getting better would feel bigger." James turns toward her. And it doesn't," she continues. "It just feels calm, like coming back to something I almost forgot." He considers this. "Maybe that's what better really is," she smiles. "Maybe." She leans her head against his shoulder, and he rests his cheek against her hair. They sit there longer than necessary, letting the night settle around them. "I don't want to rush into anything," Diep says after a while. "Not plans, not promises." James nods. "We don't have to. But," she adds, lifting her head to look at him, "I want to live, fully, with you, day by day." His eyes soften. "That's all I want too." They go back inside together. Before bed, Diep changes into her pyjamas, moving slowly but confidently. She catches her reflection in the mirror and pauses. She looks like herself again, not untouched, but whole. James waits for her, already lying on his side of the bed. When she joins him, he reaches for her hand immediately, threading their fingers together. "Tomorrow," he says quietly, "we'll do something normal." She smiles. "Like what?" "Grocery shopping," he says. She laughs softly. "That sounds perfect." They lie there, facing the ceiling, hands still joined. "James," Diep says after a moment. "Yeah? If I ever forget how this feels, remind me." He turns toward her. "I will." She closes her eyes, breathing deeply. The house hums gently around them. No machines, no uncertainty. Just two people sharing space, sharing time. As sleep pulls her under, Diep realizes something important. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in a hand held without fear, in a home that waited, in love that stayed, not because it was asked to, but because it chose to. And this time, that was enough.
Cậu cháu ra nương mía dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.